Virginia Postrel. Welcome to my podcast. My guest is Joel Miller, who has spent his career as a writer and publishing executive, and who writes an excellent popular Substack called Miller's Book Review. In this conversation, which was recorded on September 13th, we talk a lot about how book publishing works. We talk about how the interests and concerns of authors and publishers sometimes diverge, the importance of audiobooks and how they've changed the industry. We talk about why Joel selects such diverse topics for his own books as Angels and Paul Revere, and we talk about what he's learned from reading classic works. Let's get started. Good morning, Joel.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being one of my early guinea pigs.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So I want to start. So your Substack is called Miller's Book Review. So I want to start with a question about the books that you write about. At the beginning of the year, you set out 2 challenges for yourself. One was every month to read and review a classic, I guess I would say, and the other was a memoir. How did you pick the books that you decided to do?
I kind of have a running list of things that I feel I want to read or should read. And I'm almost philosophically committed to the idea that I'm only going to read books that I find interesting in some way or another. So I have to, the whim to read that book has to be there in the first place. So I keep this list, and then I'm on Twitter and elsewhere in places where I just see wonderful book recommendations all the time. So I'm always adding to that list. And then at the end of the year, I look at that list and I usually share several suggestions with my readers and just say, here are 12 novels, classic novels that I'm thinking about reading. And in this case, this year I added 12 classic memoirs.
Right.
And I just said, am I missing anything? What would you recommend? And I take all that input together and, shake it up real good, and out comes my list.
Right. So we're 3/4 through the year. What have you liked best that you've read?
I
know that's a hard question.
It's so hard because there's so many great things. This might surprise, anybody, I don't know, but everybody has read, I thought, Slaughterhouse-Five. I somehow missed it in high school. I never read it in college. So I finally just said, this is the year I'm going to finally read some Kurt Vonnegut. And I put that down on the list. And I was really surprised and delighted by that book. On the memoir side, I read Frederick Douglass's first memoir, his first autobiography, The Narrative. And I really loved that. There's so many great stories, though. I would say every one of the books I read in the list this year for both the novels and the memoirs have been surprising in certain ways.
Right. What is the value of setting that goal for yourself?
Well, this is a little intangible. However, I'm fairly convinced that, and by fairly, I mean I'm 100% convinced that reading works that are considered canonical or adjacent to the canon, however that is fuzzily defined, is beneficial for a handful of reasons. One of them could be something as simple as just general cultural literacy. Walking into a group of people and somebody brings up a reference to, for instance, Kurt Vonnegut, I'm in a worse position for not knowing what that is a reference to.
Right.
So it's just wise to be kind of current with things that are generally understood or respected or known. But then on the other side of it, there's also the kind of moral enlargement and self-improvement that can come from those kinds of books. And that could be true for anything current too. It's just that the books that generally over time people have said, yes, this book is really valuable along those lines, tend to have been proven by time and other people's, vast opinions at this point to validate that. So for instance, Their Eyes Were Watching God is
Hmm.
a really delightful and surprising novel in so many ways. And that, that could be just as true for a modern novelist to have written something like
Right.
that, and for us to have that take. It's just that we do have that take historically, and it's been validated over the decades.
Right. 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 So I see behind you, you have a lot of books. uh,
Yes, yeah.
um, and are they well organized, or are they just like, well, I kind of know this one is got an orange cover and it's
Yeah.
in this general vicinity?
Well, they're mostly well organized. They start off better organized on this side, which you can't see, but this
Right.
is a shelf of a whole wall of mostly history, and anything related to it that is time specific is chronologically filed. So I've
Yeah.
got a lot of overview stuff up top, but then it moves historically from, the ancient world into the modern world.
Uh-huh.
And I've got, authorities that were writing at their times filed chronologically. So
Hmm.
I know, the arguments Augustine are having are relevant to the time that he's writing. And so I have those histories all together with, his work, for instance,
Right. Right.
or Montaigne, during the Renaissance and things
Right.
like that,
Right. Right.
early modern era.
Yeah.
Behind me, I get, more into, these are more like business books and things like that I have for professional reasons.
Hmm.
And then off to the side over here, I have classic fiction mostly.
Hmm. 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 So one of the reasons, aside from enjoying your Substack and kind of knowing you more as an online friend, I don't think we've ever met in
Hmm.
person, but I one reason I wanted to have you on the podcast was that I found that whenever I write about publishing,
Yeah.
readers are very interested, um, because it's kind of a black box to most
Yeah.
people. And, my readers tend to be people who read a lot and are interested in books. And they're very curious about how books get published. And so, you've spent much of your career in publishing. And first of all, could you explain a little bit about that? And then we'll talk about some specific questions that
Yeah.
people have.
I've been a writer and an editor now most of my professional life. And I started off in journalism,
Mhm.
and from there moved into publishing. So in 2001, I went to work um, for an imprint that later was absorbed into some work at Thomas Nelson. And when that happened, that was in 2003. When that happened, I became a Thomas Nelson employee. At that
Okay.
point, I was a senior editor, and I edited and acquired books. And then I eventually worked my way up to publisher of that particular division that I was involved in, along with a few other imprints. And then um, over time, my job, continued to change and evolve. I eventually became VP of acquisitions. So my primary job at that point was to acquire new authors and then edit some portion of those books that I brought in, depending on workload and relationships with
Right.
the authors.
Right. And was Thomas Nelson owned by HarperCollins throughout that period, or was it acquired during your tenure?
It was acquired after or near the end of the time I was
Okay.
there.
Yeah. Yeah. Because,
Um, yeah.
yeah, for those who don't know, I associate Thomas Nelson with publishing Bibles, partly
Yes.
because I, once upon a time, as if people have read my post about my life, I worked in a bookstore when I was a teenager in Greenville, South Carolina, where we sold a lot of Bibles. Uh,
Yeah.
um, but they are a religiously oriented
Yep.
imprint. But I think a lot of the things that happen in book publishing happen the same, more or less the same way, regardless of what the specific niche of the imprint is. Um, so when you're talking about acquiring a book,
Hmm.
deciding to publish it, how does that process work?
Well, it can work a handful of ways. There are sort of like there's a standard track that a project might run down,
Right. Let's
and this
start with that one.
yeah, the standard track would be that an author works with an agent, they develop a proposal, and that proposal gets shopped to a handful of publishers. Some agents work um, like where they'll blanket, a whole bunch of people. Most agents work a little bit more strategically than that.
Right.
They're going to identify 4 or 5 different houses where they think it really will fit the best. Usually they have relationships with those editors already, the acquiring editor at that other at the house. Maybe not, but they usually have some kind of relationship. And then they'll pitch the book. On the publisher side, they'll receive the proposal, and it could be one of 20 or 30 that come in that month that the particular team is looking at, and they'll sit down and usually have some kind of internal conversation as an editorial team, like, do we think that this is a strong project or not?
Right.
And then usually there's some kind of check with the sales team and the marketing teams to find out what is the possibility for this book in terms of what's the size, the reach of this product,
Hmm.
because every book is really fundamentally just a unique product. And the
Right.
question is, what kind of market is there for this book?
Right.
And if there's agreement that there's a good market for that book, and there's a handful of things that go into making that decision, they'll go ahead and make an offer potentially on that book to the agent,
Mhm.
which the agent will then, run the
Right.
traps on,
Right.
and then they'll come up with a deal.
Right. Right. So what determines what well, first of all, what is a proposal like? Because this is another
Yeah.
thing. I'm often in the position of advising would-be authors on their proposals, and I send them mine, and they're usually surprised at how long they are.
Yeah, they're long. They can be very long. I think I just mentioned a second ago that a book is like a product, and I think if you think about a book proposal like a business plan, that's actually a very advantageous way to think, because what you're trying to do in a book proposal is sell a concept or a story or something like that to a publisher, and you're fundamentally walking into an area where the publisher is going to absorb the majority of the risk. And that risk is going to look like tying up editorial time and the team's bandwidth on that project. It's going to look like getting covers designed. It's going to look like time spent with marketing and time spent with salespeople. It's going to look like the real physical costs of having it printed. There's a lot of skin in the game that the publisher has, including risking their financial, the investment of an advance.
Yeah.
And
As an
so,
author, I find this idea that the publisher is taking all the risk. I totally understand, or most of the
right.
risk. I find I I I understand why the publisher thinks of it that way, but it's a joke
Yeah.
because the author is spending years of their
Years.
life
Right.
working on this project.
Yep. You are 100% right. So I'll come back to the risk assessment part of it in a
Yeah,
second.
right.
But one of the hardest things actually about publishing is that publishers and authors have to come together to get aligned around a project when their interests are fundamentally different. And that's tricky, because for the author, like you just said, you've invested all these years. I'm working on a book right now that I've now been working on over 10 years. And it'll finally be done in January. And I have a publisher ready to publish it. I've got a contract. Everything is all finally buttoned up, and it's going to happen. But I am the one who have spent all these years, who has done all the research and all this kind of stuff. I am heavily invested in this book being a success.
Right.
And the publisher is theoretically also invested in that book being a success, but in a much, much different way, because the publisher has a list of books that they're shepherding into market during a certain season. And they're a little bit like a baseball team. They don't have to have every pitch be hit in order to get guys on base and run and score home runs. They just need to have some. And so their interest is in their list. My interest is in my book. And sometimes those align with each other and sometimes they don't. And authors really do sometimes feel a lot of frustration and alienation from their own publisher when a publisher can just see a book's not getting traction and they stop working it, or they move on to something else. And there can be a lot of frustration there for sure.
Yeah. And And also and I'm sure this is related to the list, for the publisher, there's a very small window where they pay attention to that book at the
Yeah,
right at and then they move on to the next book. And for the book to be a success, the author has to continue to pay attention to the book.
that's correct.
And the other thing is, I think would-be authors need to understand that they have to do a lot of the marketing for the book,
Yes.
that the
You know,
publisher, yeah, go on.
yeah. So publishers have a lot of things that they do on the marketing side that are very valuable and would be very time consuming and difficult for somebody that didn't know what they were doing to learn it and just step in and do it. Including things like creating copy that will go out to all the retailers, getting ads placed for the book, and things like that. So there are several things along those lines that a publisher does to kind of grease the skids for the market to find the book in the first place. But it's really up to the author how far that book's going to penetrate, because a lot of what gets a book off the ground is the author's network talking about the book,
Right,
sharing the book, and creating an expectation in the marketplace for how great this will be or how great it is, and then the market responding. And when the market responds, if there's enough momentum behind the audience picking up the book, reading it, saying this is incredible, and on they go, then a book may take on a life of its own. If it doesn't take on a life of its own, and even if it does, the author still has an ongoing, if they care about their book, they
right,
have an ongoing incentive to keep flogging it, keep pushing it, to look for opportunities to
right,
talk about it, inserting it into conversations that are happening in the public,
right,
looking for ways to talk about it. Because the life of a book is in the eyeballs of the readers. And if the readers just stop noticing or don't care because they're on to other things,
right.
then the book dies.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned advertising, which is not something I mean, I associate a lot with book publishing,
Hmm.
especially compared to other media. I mean, my sister-in-law recently retired from being in the movie trailer business,
Yeah.
and I don't know, any film or TV show that is coming up gets a lot of marketing dollars because there's a
Yeah.
lot of marketing. I mean, there's a lot of money at stake. And that's not true for books, which have much smaller audiences. For
Yeah.
typical, I mean, if it's somebody who's an established best-selling author, that's a different. How how does a publisher decide when it's going to actually engage in advertising as opposed to publicity efforts or sales efforts through, the
Yeah.
the salespeople talking to the bookstores kind of thing?
There's a little bit of, every book is a unique product. And so there's almost always a unique approach to every book.
Right,
Now, some of it is going to end up being, fairly boilerplate. They're going to do X, Y, and Z,
right,
and that's going to be standard for pretty much every book they do across the list. But then, depending on how much they've invested in a book, so let's say an author is what might be called an A author on the list. This is somebody that they have huge expectations for. They've paid a lot of money for this book. They have a huge incentive to make sure that they
right,
sell the maximum amount, because this is the only way that they'll actually make their list work, is if the ones that they've heavily invested on, enough of those perform to their
right, right,
expectations. Otherwise, they'll end up investing in ways that won't return, and they'll go
right,
bankrupt.
right.
So, and I mean, honestly, that happens a
Sure.
lot. Publishing is a fantastic way to lose money.
Yeah.
So when they're busy figuring that out per book on a list, there's going to be a handful of like kind of low tier books, or you might call them C titles on a list,
Mhm.
that are all going to get kind of the basics, and
Right,
then they're going to escalate up depending on opportunity and just the investment the publisher already has in it.
right,
And
right,
so there's all kinds of things these days that are more open to advertising because of various social media platforms.
right,
And so
right.
you'll see more social media ads today than there ever used to be. And now the other good thing is, I mean, good is relative. For a publisher, they love this because there's metrics attached to that.
Yeah,
So if you have, dollars you're spending, you can calculate the ROI on that ad
Right.
based on, what you sold. Putting an ad in the New York Times, for instance,
Yeah.
there's no way to know.
Yeah.
I had an author once who um, insisted that we pay for placement in the New York Times to promote his book. And there were a lot of good things happening with this book. And so we're kind of like, well, I mean, it was not in our ad budget. We didn't have that planned at that point, but we just figured out where to go grab the money from, which of course actually means that there were some other authors that didn't get, that money spent on them. But we went ahead and placed the ad, and the book performed really well over many, many, many weeks. And the hard thing was he wanted to do that ad again because he was convinced that ad's what did it. And, we're looking at it going, that ad didn't do anything. But, you know, but we got to
Yeah.
keep investing in it in order to
Right.
keep him
Right.
happy and keep
Right.
him going. And so
So, so
it's
how
a
do I
mix.
get that kind of power over my publisher?
Yeah. You need a book that's kind of working. It needs to be kind of running, and they need to be afraid of messing it up.
Yeah. Well, I have a book that's working, and it, and of course, my most recent book, The Fabric of Civilization, came out in November 2020, which was the height of the pandemic. And,
Yep.
a November book, obviously you want people to buy it for presents.
Yeah.
And this book was actually my first book to be published in the UK, but it was published in the UK through Basic Books, which was the
Yeah.
US thing. Anyway, right before Christmas 2020, the entire United Kingdom ran out of my book.
Yeah.
And because of the pandemic, it was impossible to get copies over there. So someone came to me and said, I want to buy this for, my relative for Christmas, and I can't get it. What do I do? And I asked my editor, and she did a little research, and she came back and said, if you order it from Amazon US, you can get it there in time. So I passed that word along. But, authors, every author I have ever met basically hates their publisher. They often love their editor at the publisher.
Yeah.
They often love their editor,
Yeah.
but they hate the marketing end. They're frustrated. They
Yeah.
and I don't hate them. I would be happy with Basic again, even though they screwed that particular thing up, basically because they didn't have faith that the book would sell.
Yeah.
They didn't have enough copies over there. But,
so the way the challenge with that is, and the way this functionally happens is, it used to be, this is the model when I first started in publishing, this was kind of the standard model. Amazon wasn't a thing.
right.
And the kind of phrase was stack them high and watch them fly, by which they meant you load in as many books as a retailer will take.
Right.
And that retailer, just because of the sheer presence of that book in that store,
Right.
it will get eyeballs and people will walk away with it. And if done with a great marketing campaign, a great publicity campaign, then you can drive a lot of sales.
Yeah.
And there's some truth to that. But it's risky for the stores, and it's risky for the publishers. And over time, they have just figured out ways of making retail inventories much more just in time.
Right.
And what that fundamentally means is, for a publisher to go to market with a book, instead of going to market with like 20,000 units potentially in stores, they're going to market when a book launches with maybe just 2,500 units in stores. And suddenly now, and they may only print to that number.
Right. And partly the economics of printing have changed. It used to be that it was a really high setup cost and low per copy cost. And so therefore your print runs were larger, and there've been I'm not sure all the changes that have taken place, but it's clearly more economical nowadays to do a shorter print run.
Yeah. And so you'll end up with a print run of maybe 2,500 or 3,500 copies. And the whole thing is based on, well, let's just see what happens. If it starts to run, then we can just hurry up and print more. And it usually takes about 3 weeks, maybe 4, to get books back in stores. And so it's worth the risk on their part. But of course, the frustration for the author is, I've got all this media lined up and there's no books in stores now. and you go to Amazon and it says will ship in 4 weeks or whatever. And
Yeah.
so people don't buy. And then by the time they finally get inventory back in, all the publicity for the book is over.
Right.
And, you may not be able to gin it up again. And
Right.
so there's a tension there for sure.
Yeah. 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 And it's a constant learning. And as you say, every book is a unique product. And so it's very difficult to figure out how a given book will do, partly
Yeah.
because there are random factors. I mean,
So many random factors.
I have a friend who actually had a book come out on 9/11, and
Yeah.
I think it was about the history of advertising or something like that. It's completely unrelated.
Right.
Whereas the what was it, Jihad versus McWorld? That book suddenly
Hmm.
started blowing off the shelves just because it had the word jihad in it.
Right.
Terrible.
It just happened to be
Yeah, right.
something that was in the market that was close enough to whatever was happening in the universe that people said, I have to understand. And that's the book that was available.
Right. Terrible book, by the way. Don't read that book. So you have written books on a very wide variety of subjects. I didn't realize this till I was looking into this, investigating you for this podcast, including Paul Revere, Angels, the Drug War, and Big Government. Plus, you edited a volume of primary sources, and now you're writing a book on books.
Yes.
Hey, how do you decide what subjects are worth your time?
Clearly, it's not discipline or consistency. That those don't really roll into the consideration. I think a book to me is always a worthy book for me to work on is one that I find fascinating. The subject matter somehow fascinating. And if I can convince other people that it's also fascinating and convince them to give me a contract, then I might have a book,
Right.
And so over the years, that the book on narcotics, Bad Trip, I wrote that in 2003, 2002, in that period, and it came out in 2004. I just was obsessed with drug policy at the time, particularly with the Bill of Rights impacts of the drug war. And I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop reading about it and writing about it. And so I knew that I had a book there. And then the same was true ultimately for, everything else on that list. Paul Revere, I had read Esther Forbes's biography of Paul Revere when I was a teenager or my late teens, early 20s. And when all these big books on the founders were kind of coming out, 2007, 2008, 2009, in that period, I just thought, the one person that gets completely overlooked these days is Paul Revere. And there's good reasons for that. He's not important in the way that a Samuel Adams or a John Adams, even more importantly, would be. But he was in the mix with those guys and represented something uniquely American at the time in a way that I thought, I got to tell this story. I got to tell the Paul Revere story.
So talk a little bit about the Paul Revere story.
Well, if your entry point into the American founding is through the founders, it's very intellectual. It's very philosophical. There's a lot of arguments that are rather elevated around rights and all that kind of thing, and all very important. But there's another side of it, which is that there is the almost, you could call it like the Tom Paine blue collar side of it, where all these random people who make up this country at that point, or rather the colonies at that point, somehow have to believe all of this esoteric stuff and think that it's worth getting shot over.
Right.
And they have to be mobilized in such a way. And Paul Revere kind of represents that connection point between the lofty arguments and the ideals and how they get interpreted on the ground by essentially a blue collar kind of guy. And I loved that, almost that transmission of one kind of conversation to another kind of action. And I just thought that was really compelling, especially when you think about what kind of person Paul Revere was. His father was a French refugee who landed in Boston, and was apprenticed out, as a child. And so he eventually, earned his right to go out into business for himself. He marries, starts a family. Paul Revere comes along as one of many kids in this family, and then of course he gets married and has many kids. Married twice. His first wife dies. Um, all along the way, he represents this new kind of person in the world, which is an entrepreneur, somebody who is really motivated by figuring out how to scratch a business out of nothing, um, and does that his whole life. He died in, I think, 1818, so he lived quite a while. He lived all the way through, the Stamp Act crisis and all of that. He was born in, I think, the 1730s. So he lives a very long time. He actually outlived many of his children. And all that time, he's just busy trying to make stuff happen, including getting on the front end of the Industrial Revolution. He was very interested in manufacturing and all of that. So he represents kind of a new kind of person in the world, a uniquely American kind of person. And I just thought he has a fascinating story, and people need to hear it again.
Yeah, that's interesting. I suspect you've probably sold some books talking about it, because it is interesting. It reminds me of a book I read called, I think it's called Marketplace of Revolution. It's by a historian called, I forget, something H. Breen,
Yeah, T.H.
Breen.
Breen.
T.H. Breen, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and he came up in that. Yeah, yeah. So, all right, so you did the drug war, you did Paul Revere, you did Angels, which that was an interesting one, which
Yeah.
I didn't see that one coming.
I didn't either at the time. This would be like a kind of a sidestep from my typical public persona, if I have such a thing. I grew up in a Christian household, and but it was Protestant evangelical, and there was no understanding of what angels are historically in terms of the way people have thought about them. It was just not a topic. And then I became Eastern Orthodox, and angels are everywhere in the liturgy and the artwork and everything. And I was struck by that I could go from one world where they were basically a non-topic to a world where they're constantly referred to, and ostensibly both the same sorts of things, in the sense that they're both Christian traditions.
Right.
And so I decided to kind of do a historical dive into that and just look at where does this worldview come from that holds all this in it. And so I looked at the scriptures, I looked at the liturgical tradition, the iconography of the church, and all of those kinds of sources. And through it all, I was able to kind of tease out a narrative of what has been taught, and what are these ideas, and who are these characters, these angels,
right.
and came up with that book.
Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting reading some of the Amazon reviews, particularly one that was trying to figure out, the person was writing was Catholic, but they were kind of trying to suss out where you were coming from, and they didn't like that you didn't say Saint so and so and Saint so and so. You would just say Augustine or whatever. Anyway,
it was an odd book to write in certain ways, because I was trying to be accessible to really Christians of any tradition, or people even not Christians who just happen to have some historical interest in the topic.
Right.
And so I did avoid things like referring to people as Saint so-and-so, which then offended the people that apparently wanted that.
Yeah,
so.
I don't know whether that person was offended or just baffled.
Yeah,
I couldn't quite tell. But they didn't think you were hostile. They were just like, "Who is this guy? What is he?
All right, what does he think he's doing?" Right.
So you wrote a Substack post about writing in your books and why people write in their books, and which was enjoyable. Why do you write in your books? And I wanted to know, what do you write with when you write in your books?
Yeah. Well, let me start by answering that, because I have two examples right in front of me. One would be a pencil. This is just a number 2 pencil. And then another one would be a friction pen from Pilot. So that's an erasable ink,
Ah,
which is nice. So like I've only done this a couple times, but I have written extensive notes in books and then erased all of those notes before passing the book on. Um, so you can actually you can restore those notes by making the book very cold, which is weird, but you can make those marks vanish by making them hot. So if you warm the pages, the ink will disappear.
right.
Um, so that's a neat little hack. But yes, I love to write in my books because it makes them more useful. I'm not a collector. I own about 3,000 books, or have about 3,000 books in this house, and they're kind of coming in and coming out just depending on my needs. And I only have so much space, so at some point I'm full again, and I look around and I start picking things that I know I don't need anymore, and I'll just let them go. So I'm not a collector. I write in everything. I remember when I was working on the Paul Revere book, I had a book by Charles Ferris Gedemy, which was a biography written of Revere in the early 1900s or late 1800s, one or the other. And I had the book, and it's nice and old, and I didn't want to damage it or anything, but I was working up against a deadline that was just not going to give me any relief, and I needed to write in that book if I was going to be able to remember certain things. And it just occurred to me that I own this book. This is my book. I'm not accountable to anybody for this book other than myself. And so I just started writing in this old book. And I posted something about that. And Charles Ferris Gedemy's great granddaughter found it and read it. I guess she was searching for his name. And she wrote me and she said, I think he'd be okay with it. So I felt better.
Yeah, I think most authors would be okay with people writing in their books, uh, because it means you're engaged with the reading.
Yeah.
I'm inconsistent about whether I write in my books. I When I'm teaching a book, which isn't
Hmm.
very often, but when I was teaching at Chapman and I write in my books always with pencil. And
Yeah.
and when I need, or when I'm going to a Liberty Fund conference or some other conference where I'm going to be discussing a book, I write in my book with pencil. When I'm reading books for writing books, which um, I tend to do more, I just put lots and lots of little Post-it notes
Yep.
on the
Yep.
side. My husband calls it fungus. That he looks at the
Yeah.
side of
Just
the book,
yeah,
and
encrusted in the book.
right, and then I go back and sometimes I recreate. Sometimes I actually type in quotes from the book into a file.
Hmm.
And when I was writing The Future and Its Enemies, I did that for every book I read, and so I had these enormous files full of lots of time, which was also a way of reviewing it. Now, if
Yeah.
I think I'm going to likely quote a book a lot, I try to get an electronic version where I can do the
Yeah.
same thing with less typing.
That's wise.
Yeah.
I think that I like to write in books when I'm going to have an argument with it in some way, where I want to be engaged in it. I want to remember key points. I want to challenge something later, or I would just want to go look it up later. Anything like that. And then I'll also oftentimes make notes on, like this point here relates to what he said over here on page 83. And, so there'll be some hyperlinking in the book that I'm
Yeah.
doing also.
Yeah.
I find that very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, if I'm reading fiction, I underline in fiction too, or notate in fiction, because sometimes there's just a choice line that you want to remember. I'm finding that somewhat frustrating right now with Middlemarch, where George Eliot is like an aphorist, and
Yeah,
so
right.
every I don't know, every page or every other page there's some great aphorism, and you're like, look at that, there's
Yeah,
another one.
yeah,
you know
yeah, yeah, yeah.
so
A book you might enjoy, it's a memoir, not a classic memoir, it's not that old, is My Life in Middlemarch by Rebecca Mead.
I have that right behind me.
Yeah, because I I had read Middlemarch in college and really liked
Uh-huh.
it. And I reread it about a year ago, and
Okay.
and then I read that book. And
That you're on exactly the track that I'm going
yeah,
to be running myself. I'm going to finish Middlemarch and then read her book just to
yeah,
see,
yeah,
what was her take on it.
yeah. And actually, I said this segues to another topic, which I said I read Middlemarch and I read Rebecca Mead's book, but I actually listened to both of them, and I
Hmm.
intend to. I couldn't find my copy of Middlemarch that I had from college, and so, although I still believe it is somewhere around, so I got a new copy of it because I do intend to read it with my eyes
Yeah.
again, but because it's a book that bears many rereadings,
Oh
which
yeah.
is what
Yeah.
Rebecca Mead's book is about, reading it over different times in her life. But how do you've written about audiobooks. Where do audiobooks fit into the world of reading and the world of publishing also, if you have any insights on
Yeah.
how
Well,
publishers deal with
I
them?
remember, I'll just tell you this personal story because this involves you. I remember when Fabric of Civilization came out and there was no audiobook available when the book first came out.
Right, it was about a year because they had
Yeah.
a terrible time selling the audiobook. I
Interesting.
think it got sold to the I mean, they went to every audiobook publisher. I probably shouldn't say this, but they went to every audiobook publisher, and I think it got sold by the last
Yeah.
one on the list. Um,
Well,
anyway.
I think the reason I still remember that is that I love to engage in audiobook because I walk a lot. Every day I usually walk, I don't know, 5 miles at least.
Mhm.
And um, that's a lot of time to be listening to
Yeah,
podcasts. And I'd rather listen to a book
right.
than a podcast. As much as I love podcasts. I mean, here we are on a podcast.
Yeah.
But for just the benefit of being able to kind of like have somebody's language just wash over you.
Yeah,
There's something really pleasant about an audiobook. However, and this is the negative, it does wash over you, which is a different kind of engagement than reading with your eyes. And there's been a fair amount of research that's been done on this that will make these kinds of distinctions that for more passive entertainment kind of books, audios are great. If you need to critically engage with it, though, it's not ideal because um, it's harder, for instance, to go back to
right.
check
Yeah,
something,
very hard.
which when you're critically engaging in a book, you're doing that probably every
Yeah,
couple of pages.
yeah,
You just can't do that in an audiobook. It's really hard to capture quotes in an audiobook. So if an author is making a point that you really need to retain for some reason, it's challenging to mark that in any kind of way that's efficient.
yeah.
So it's preferable if you're going to be critically engaging in a book, you're probably better off reading a physical copy or a digital copy that you can
Right,
underline or mark up
right.
in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, I once tried to listen to an audiobook of one of David Hume's philosophical work.
Oh my gosh.
It did not go well. It was
No.
I didn't I was like I got it from the library and I was like, no, that is not going to work at all. There have been cases I can't remember where I owned and had read where I had read the hard copy and I owned a Kindle version and I was
Hmm.
listening to something and then I would just use the bookmark function and then search. The advantage of the Kindle
Yep.
version was I could then search for that passage and mark it. But yeah, you're right. There is a kind of washing over you. It's not and many of the audiobooks I listen to are entertainment,
Sure. Yep.
genre fiction, mysteries, that sort of thing. Although I did listen to Middlemarch and I did listen to Moby Dick, which I've wrote about how they were both actually really good audiobook experiences.
Yeah. I bet they would be. I've not, I'm reading a physical copy of Middlemarch right now,
Yeah, yeah,
and I've enjoyed it in part for that point about the aphorisms. There's so many quotable lines, and I just find
yeah,
myself
yeah,
having to underline
yeah,
as I go. But I could also imagine that story being just beautiful to listen to
yeah,
because the language is so elegant, and the characters are in some cases so surprising and interesting
yeah,
that just listening would be
Yeah,
really enjoyable.
right. And the particular version of I mean, I will need to, if I really want to absorb Moby Dick, I will need to read it, in a printed copy. But the audiobook version I listened to, the narrator was just amazing. I mean, he was somebody who had essentially dedicated his life. He was an actor from the time he was an undergraduate at Princeton to performing Moby Dick. I mean,
Oh my goodness. Could you get anybody better for the role? That's
and
amazing.
he was amazing, and especially in the early parts of the book, Moby Dick is really funny, which I
Hmm.
wouldn't have thought, but he brings that out. There's a certain amount of sort of friendly satire, I guess I would call
Yeah.
it. It's not mean satire, but of the whaling village and the church and the whalers and in the early parts of it. So that was interesting. Interesting thing. So when you listen to a book, do you refer to it as reading the book or not?
Yeah. I I figure that, I mean, fundamentally I'm digesting the book. I'm consuming the book in some form or another. I often will buy the physical copy just to have, and so sometimes I'll get back from my walk and I'll spend 30 minutes after, just like going back into the book and finding the things that were of interest to me. I just read, and I, use the verb read, A
Yeah,
Movable Feast by Hemingway. And of
right.
course, in this instance, I didn't read it. I listened to it. But as soon as I got back from the house on every walk, there was like 27 things I had to go find uh, in every chapter, or in the part that I had listened to
Right,
that day.
right. Yeah,
Um, that's a great example of actually the challenge of trying to engage a piece of classic literature, or really any literature, through an audiobook. If it is something that you need to retain or work with, it's not the best medium.
right.
It's still great. I mean, I would rather listen to the audio in certain instances and then follow back up with the book, or do vice versa. Listen to the audio after I've read the book. Either
Right,
way,
right,
some books are just worth digesting in multiple ways, multiple times.
right. The other thing, this wouldn't apply to fiction, but for nonfiction, a, a disadvantage of the audiobook, which I learned when The Fabric of Civilization actually came out as an audiobook and
Hmm.
started to get a little bit of feedback from readers, is that the notes aren't there.
Yeah.
And in my book, my editor felt very strongly that she didn't want to have a lot of names of the people that who I was sourcing information from. So it will say a historian says blah blah blah,
Right.
on the assumption that if you really care who the
Right. You just flip
historian
to the
is,
back.
you can flip to the back. But you can't do that in an audiobook. And fortunately, I had actually put the notes online on my website uh, for a different reason, which was that the notes are not part of the index. And
Hmm.
so I wanted to have a searchable thing for people who wanted to find notes. Um, how you tell the audiobook readers that these notes are there and if they're curious they can find them is another question, and
Yeah.
I have no way of reaching the mass audiobook listening public, but I do mention that whenever I have an opportunity that's there. Do you ever listen to nonfiction? Well, I guess Movable Feast is nonfiction, but it's sort of memoir.
Yeah. I listened to both. Jennifer Burns's most recent book, the biography of Milton
Oh,
Friedman.
right. Yeah.
I listened to that on audio,
Hmm.
and enjoyed it. It was a great way to digest it. I
Hmm.
was traveling, and so I was in a couple different cities, and in between, being back at home, and so that book, that'd be a big book to be lugging around,
Yeah, yeah, I do have a
wherever.
physical copy, but I haven't read it, so
Yeah, it's delightful. It's misnamed, but it's delightful.
uh-huh,
Mistitled, but it's
yeah,
delightful.
yeah. Uh, Going back to your experience in publishing, how does having all these different forms of books affect how publishers think about a a title, and how does it work?
Well, um, so right now, audiobooks, well, actually, let's back up to 2007. In
Okay.
2007, the iPhone came out and the Kindle came out. And there was this kind of assumption that ebooks would do to publishing um, what iTunes had
Right.
done to MP3s had done to the music business.
Yeah.
I never believed that at the time because as a very serious reader, I knew nobody is going to want to actually read bite-sized bits of books, which is what the conversation was at the time, that we need to figure out how to digitize everything so that we can basically sell off just chapters at a time because some people don't want the whole book, and I thought, you guys, like, I'm talking to publishing professionals and I'm saying, you don't even understand how people read. Like, that is never going to happen. And there is, by the way, there is a format for that already. It's called a magazine. So, like, if that's what we're going to do, then we're really changing everything. Well, thankfully that blew over and nobody really did that much or well anyway. But one thing was everyone was afraid about was that ebooks would suddenly just like cannibalize everything.
Right.
And
Yes.
it just never happened. Like you can think about fiction, maybe certain fiction titles sell 50-50 ebook and print.
Right.
But that's not even typical. It's probably more like 20 to 25% of total sales on a book will be ebooks. Certainly for like in terms of the total number of books being sold, that's about the number is
Right.
around 25%, somewhere in there. But at the same time, what was overlooked was that iPhone was the much more interesting invention, not the Kindle, and much more determinative for what would happen to publishing, not the Kindle, because the iPhone eventually enabled us to have ebook apps and audiobook apps. And the audiobook apps is actually the fundamental difference because when, you can remember the phone version of audiobooks,
Right.
it looked like getting CDs,
Yeah.
and you'd get this big cluster of CDs in a case that was very clunky, very difficult to walk around with. And depending on how long that book was, it could be, like 2, 3, 4 CDs. That's not too bad. But like if you got the Lord of the Rings on CD, that thing must have been like 20 CDs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and the bigger the book, the more likely you're going to want to maybe listen to it, but you can't because it's just too many CDs.
Right.
And you can't keep them. Like there's just too many. So the limited market was library patrons
Right.
would go get those and or other facilities where people could borrow them.
Right.
But
Right.
you're never going to get a big market off of borrowing. And so you had to come up with a way of selling them, and you had to have a way where you could stack them up and have zero impact to your life. And the only way to do that is in a digital environment on your phone, where suddenly you have the library available, the means to play it available, and utter total portability.
Right.
And that meant that you could listen to an audiobook wherever, whenever, under any circumstances. And suddenly, once that took off, people realized that's where the real market is. So the real disruptor is audiobooks. And that's been true. They're not, I mean, they perform a little bit more than ebooks on the total numbers. But, with some books, you may have 50% of the books that go out are audiobooks. And that's why, like when a book comes out, you hope that it'll be available in all formats because some people, they just gravitate to audiobooks.
Yeah.
And if it's not available, they're not going to get the book.
Right. Yeah. No, it was, and The Fabric of Civilization is the only one of my books that is available on audio as an audiobook. And partly that's because of timing. It's also
Sure.
because The Power of Glamour is a very visual book. It has lots
Yeah.
of, it's a 4-color book. It's got lots of pictures that are part of the argument. So I don't think there was a lot of interest in doing it as an audiobook, although it kind of maybe work. I don't know. It's funny. I just listened to a book, Willa Cather's One of Ours, where periodically we say, this book is continued on discs.
Right.
4. And then it was like, because clearly they had made the digital version from the original CDs. And
Yeah.
that
So
was the
they,
second book that I'd listened to that had that. I forget what the first one was.
yeah. The hard thing for publishers has been that with the boom and interest in audiobooks, keeping up with audiobook production is actually a real challenge.
Right,
So anything that they have where they have audio rights to something that they've already recorded, they're going to like flow it into the format because it's available for them to do so.
right.
But anything that's outside of that, if they don't have an audio recorded, it's a real cost benefit question of, do we go put it in this new format because it'll cost several $100s to get something up to speed. That's where the AI narrator question has become rather interesting.
Ah, yeah.
And this is one that, you know, divides people's allegiances for sure. The fastest way to get a group to disagree on anything these days is to introduce AI into the question. But AI narrators would make it possible to go back in deep into catalogs, deep into the
Right,
publishing
right.
catalog, and publish books in audio formats that, you know, otherwise would languish. For instance, The Future and Its Enemies, which I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is one of the greatest books ever written, and that book should be an audiobook.
Yeah, yeah. You think it would work even though it's full of quotes?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Because one of the weird things about that book is that, it's got lots and lots of quotes from the people I'm writing about.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I think a good narrator would,
yeah,
or a well-trained AI narrator would do really well with that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, something that people are always trying to get me to do a second edition, but the publisher is not interested. They're just, but maybe an audiobook would be of more interest.
You know, so just to challenge that, I think we're living at a time where the message of that book is more relevant than ever. You know, when it first came out, I remember there was this kind of cynicism about the Dow growing at the level that James K.
Oh,
Glassman
right.
wrote
Yes.
about,
Yeah.
and there was this kind of assumption that that was all just a fad, and then the recession comes, the kind of dot-com bubble bursts and deflates some of those hopes, and then people were like, "See, we were right. This was all just hype." But of course, it wasn't just hype. It's after the correction, it's done nothing but accelerate. And now that we're in this period of AI and everything else like that, the dynamist take on things is fundamental. It's necessary.
Well, I've got to give a talk in next month about sort of an introduction to dynamism for the progress movement types.
Mm-hmm.
That's I'm going to be sort of revisiting that a little bit in the current context. One thing people don't understand about that book, which came out in 1998, is that it was not a product of the inspiration of it was not the internet boom and
Right.
optimism. It was actually the inspiration of it was actually the pessimism that of those sort of recession and restructuring, particularly of white collar employment that occurred in the early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And in the sort of, it was particularly strong in Southern California where I was living because the end of the Cold War was, good for the world, wasn't good for people working in the defense industry, which was a lot of skilled labor and engineers and middle managers in Southern California. And I don't know if you remember the movie Falling Down, but that was the kind of quintessential movie of that period of the now obsolete middle-aged, middle class, white male guy being mad, and so anyway, there's also some of that now.
It all comes back. That's what I'm saying. I think that it's more relevant now than ever.
So what sort of advice would you give to would-be authors?
Man, first off, that's very broad. So
yes, well, narrow it down however you want.
Yeah. Well, first off, there's kind of an assumption that everyone has, which is that they've got some kind of book in them. And this is like a nearly universal thing.
Yeah.
And Flannery O'Connor was one time asked if she thought that um, if English professors had, dampened the dreams of authors, potential authors, and she said something like, I wish they would dampen more. Like they ought to destroy more dreams. I don't want to sound exactly like that, but I would say that I think sometimes people think the best thing that they can do with an idea that they have or a story they want to tell is that it has to be a book. And I would say these days, that's maybe not the case. These days, like a typical book might sell, and this is no joke, no more than 2,500 copies.
Yeah.
It might sell 5,000 if you're really honestly kind of lucky. If things really go well for you, 10, 15, 20,000 units. That's great. If you're selling 20,000 units, you're a solid B-list author who, might be able over time to actually turn it into something that would pay for your life. I doubt it, however, because that's still not enough. So if you've got a great idea, maybe it's actually a serial podcast. Maybe it's a series of videos on YouTube. There's so many different platforms and methods of getting ideas out that you can use these days. But let's say it really is a book. I would say be prepared for a lot of self-advocacy, because you have to recognize that your interests are your interests and nobody else involved in the process share your interests. They can align, they can come together
Right.
in ways that produce books and get into stores and the whole
Right.
thing, but it's not a natural. You have to work it in order for that to happen.
Right. Well, we're coming up. I think we're on our hour. So I want to end with a question, which is, what do you recommend people to read? And this could be books. It could be websites, Substacks, magazines, just, one of the things I want to do with this podcast is to give people ideas of things that they might want to follow up on.
Wow. Okay. This is like my
There are no
favorite
wrong
kind of
answers.
question. Yeah. All right. First off, I rarely make actual recommendations to people because people, they come from with their own interests, and I don't know what people like. So, but I will say I know what I like. I love history, and I love fiction, and I love anything that kind of extols, elevates human striving in a way that I find inspiring, so in some way or another. So I would say at some level, I'm like classical humanist in my bent towards thinking about the world. Small government liberal in the way I think about the way we ought to organize ourselves as societies. So any of these recommendations, I would say, are kind of coming out of that worldview. Aeon, the website, aeon.co. If you're, given to thinking about humanism, about ideas, about history, that's a wonderful website that has all of that and more on just a regular basis, a really rich feast of articles that you can partake of for free. It's a really wonderful website.
Yeah, they actually published the article that eventually led to the Fabric of Civilization.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was back in 2015, I think. And anyway, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually reflects really well on the point that it's exactly the kind of place where you're going to find those kinds of great ideas.
Yeah.
And they're really wonderfully written and wonderfully edited. So it's a great resource. I also think that Arts and Letters Daily is just a great place to go on a daily basis for just a quick hit of something interesting and literary or historical or academic. It's a great compiler of fascinating stuff. On the political side, not that I stray very far into these worlds anymore if I can avoid it, into this world if I can avoid it, but I still love reading Reason, the print magazine. I look forward to every issue that comes to my house, and of course the online presence is great and has been for so long, along with their podcasts.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there that's really great. Books, though. Books Books are really where it's at. And I would say you kind of have to follow Alan Jacobs' uh, thought, which is to read by whim. You kind of have to find the things that you love and just invest all your brain cells there if you can. And so for me, I love classic fiction right now. This is a world that, in terms of like where I was coming from as a younger person, younger adult into my 30s and early 40s, I would read like 5 or 6 novels a year. But I was never intentional about it. They would just be accidentally things that would interest me and I would go read them. I have recently just discovered, however, how much I love classic fiction, and I've just said I want to spend like a lot of time reading this kind of thing, and so I have been doing that very intentionally, and I've really loved it. And I would say um, anything that is out of that universe is worth digesting and just thinking about. A book like Betsy Smith's The Tree Grows in Brooklyn is a book that would never have crossed my radar if it weren't for just being alert to people saying, hey, this is a really great book that really speaks a lot about what it was like to grow up in America during this period and what it means to be an American.
Yeah.
And so I latched hold of that book and read it last December, and I was floored by that book. I thought it was absolutely beautiful and riveting in all kinds of ways. It's a fantastic story.
Yeah.
And so I would look for those kinds of books.
Yeah, I would second that recommendation. I read that book, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago, something like that, when I was developing one of my many syllabi for a course I never actually taught on glamour and the American dream, and that was
Uh-huh.
and I had never read it. I mean, it's a very popular book to read among younger people, particularly girls, but I didn't read it when I was growing up, and I found it was quite a good read and very, as you say, very interesting in. I mean, it's fiction, but it's based on the author's actual childhood
Yeah.
life. And so it gives you a slice of America and the immigrant experience that is on the one hand very old. It sort of ends at the time of World War One, but on the other hand, very very fresh and relevant today.
Right.
So that's a great recommendation. Well, thank you for coming on, and I will definitely have you on again. Definitely when your book is out, but possibly before then. And thanks a lot, Joel.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This was a delight.
Thanks for joining me for this conversation with Joel Miller. Please check out the show notes for information on some of the things we talked about. To read my work and hear more podcasts, subscribe to my newsletter at vpostrel.substack.com. Check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/@vpostrel, which includes a podcast playlist. You can subscribe to Virginia's podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get podcasts. My next guest will be Sam Bowman of Works in Progress magazine, where I'm a contributing editor, and Stripe Press. Hope to see you then. Thanks.